So when I'm trying to think about writing and literature and journalism and the internet and the genres of the internet, I'm trying to track a bunch of interesting kind of affinities. So one of those is that in the 21st century, the sale of memoirs that is tracked by the New York Times quadruples over the 20th century. So that's a historical event, right? That is a shift in the market. Why is that, right? Another of those is that the personal essay, which has long existed as a genre for hundreds and hundreds of years and has had different, important cultural and institutional functions, becomes the dominant genre of internet writing when we have, in the 2010s. Why is that? And there are people who've, analyzed that and said, well, it's because we fired all the journalists, right? And that your own content is a way to fuel the content mill when it doesn't have to be researched and it doesn't have to be fact checked and it doesn't have to be edited. And it's just, let me get more impressions. And also the more abject it is, or the more disclosing it is, the more traffic it fuels, right? So if the business model is site impressions, not investing in the production of ideas that then people subscribe to or something. There also are trends towards what I call kind of memoirization of fiction, right? And so one of the things that I also look at with the aid of a computational analytics expert is that for most of its 300-year history, the novel is mostly written in the third person in English. And then that suddenly changes in the late 20th century. Why is there a decline in a form that has been pretty stable for almost 300 years, and a shift towards a privatization of perspective, or kind of enclosing of perspective, and a doing away with the unique properties of fiction, which really mostly happen in the third person, right? Omniscience is not something that we get to live with in our bodies, in our lives. So I try to put a bunch of things of that nature kind of on a level together and think, like, is there an explanation for all these convergences, which have to do with changing industrial conditions in publishing and changing industrial conditions in journalism, and the changing working conditions in higher education, or the changing availability of higher education. And what emerges is this just manifesting this ethos of personalism, of self-disclosure and self-actualization and self-revelation, that's the kind of meta genre, right? That what's most important for people to write about is their own story, or what's most important for people to publish and get out there and face out, right, is their imminent experience that they are immediately living through. The idea that people would write many memoirs, like instead of like waiting till they got old to write one or so, like all of these phenomena have to be kind of accounted for. And when I try to account for that surging of the personal, it's again in those terms of, well, this isn't style. This is just me being me. This is just me being real. This is authenticity. This is like, I'm not going to fake with you all, right? I'm not going to hide things. I'm not going to keep anything private, right? And that is itself like a response to these changing labor conditions, that is just presenting itself as if it's spontaneous and as if it's like ethical and as if it's just, intimate. And there are all kinds of things that are really compelling in personal essays, and there are all kinds of things that are really compelling in people's tweets or in people's first-person narratives, right? But there's also something that's lost if that's the only form of representation that we engage in, and there's definitely something that's lost if we act like it's just a kind of neutral ethical posture rather than something that has broader social determinations.
Yeah, and I think that this being played off like it's authentic and ethical is a great tie into how this bleeds into anti-theory as a radical, right? And so the quote that I have here, I don't know if I'll read off the whole thing, but I have where you open up the section on anti-theory. You say, in his 700-page 2020 masterwork, Critique and Praxis, the Columbia law professor, Foucauldian theory expert, NPR talking head, and death penalty lawyer Bernard Harcourt pronounces that critique has become too divorced from praxis. The praxis renewal to which he enjoins his fellow theorists is surprisingly not, however, collective action, but on the same wavelength as the immediatizing impulses of autofiction and stream aesthetics, in the same underpinning of circulatory disintermediation and imaginary inflation, anti-representational emancipation. So what is anti-representational emancipation?
Right. So there's just this idea that a number of theorists have taken up, a number of writers who we might call theorists have taken up, that it's not legitimate to participate in the project of theory, that it is not legitimate to make concepts, that it is not legitimate to try to generalize or abstract or get distance on a situation, to try to historicize it, or to try to say it needs names or that we need some new ways of thinking to shift our perspective around things. And instead, what is legitimate is just to evince your perspective, right? To manifest your individual ethos and voice, to only speak for yourself, because if you're trying to represent a social truth, or you're trying to speak on behalf of a class or your comrades or your social, your social group and so on, that is just a kind of bad totalization or like, unearned authority. And that what instead the theorist should do in the conditions of this illegitimate, abstraction is just pursue concretude, right? So just give me the body, tell me about how you masturbate, tell me about how you masturbate when you have cancer, tell me about how much you suffer, tell me about your process of self-revelation and self-exploration, and make sure that you tell us that you're humble, right? And that you're doing all this disclosing, to not kind of pretend to speak for others, or to not pretend to have ideas that are resonant or transcendent. And I find that really a sad diminution of the historical task of theory. And I find it really common across a lot of kinds of disciplines, right? So Harcourt is obviously an incredible person in so many ways. Like he's a death penalty lawyer for one, but his sense of what theory is at this moment is really, really attenuated. And that's in, the kind of legal and political theory domain, but it is shared in anthropology, or it is shared in, literary and creative writing, or it is shared in in language study or in women's studies, or right. So why is that so shared? Why do we have this like retreat? Why do we have this kind of like ethical glamorization of what are some really degraded working conditions for producing theory? Because most professors have had their labor casualized and kind of precaritized and made very extreme, and library budgets have been slashed, and research budgets have been slashed, and the kind of conditions for engaging in the slow, deliberative, collaborative work of making new ideas have been totally degraded by the assault on education, right? Why do you want to glamorize that degraded condition as humility, as weak theory, as one trend calls it, right? Humbly, right? That's what I'm trying to sort of track.